future. So now specifically, I want to talk a little bit about coronavirus. As we're all aware, it's a very difficult time for everybody at the moment. But for deaf people, we're facing a lot of barriers at the moment, as you already know. Most mainstream services and agencies don't have any deaf awareness. Most of them don't know much about the deaf community or about deaf culture, and they're very unaware. Also, lots of services are unsure how to support deaf people best, so often they end up signposting, but it might not be their signposting to appropriate agencies. And the main thing is facing communication barriers that we deaf people face regularly, and not knowing whether to disclose, not knowing what their rights are, or who to ask for help, for example. There are other barriers the deaf community can face. Another barrier to communication is the regular wearing of masks. That can make communication even harder for deaf people. Deaf people can become exhausted, asking people to take down their masks and trying to lip read. And of course, some people will refuse to take off their mask, which makes it very difficult for deaf people to communicate. And it's such an effort to try and get people to engage and communicate with you, so that becomes an extra barrier. It can also be difficult supporting people remotely. Lots of the mainstream services are now operating largely on the telephone, which we know is inaccessible for deaf people. And also live chats are sometimes offered by services, but for a lot of deaf people, English is not their first language. If they're BSL users, they'll find it more difficult to communicate in written English through a live chat. I'm sure you're all aware and have heard in the news that Where is the Interpreter campaign that the deaf community are running. You will have seen other countries across the world, in New Zealand, for example, Ireland, Scotland, France, Australia, various other countries have sign language interpreters at the daily news briefings to give information about coronavirus, important information. But here in England, we haven't got that. There are in-vision interpreters, but they're only available on one specific channel. They're not available on the typical BBC channels, only on BBC News, which can be really confusing for deaf people not knowing, not understanding the information being given, or not knowing which channel to access, and so it's not good enough. For a lot of deaf people, going out and meeting other people in the community, you know, face to face, being able to communicate with them is such a lifeline. And now being in lockdown and stuck at home can cause a lot of loneliness for people. Deaf victims can sometimes feel frightened to disclose abuse because they're worried about rumours or worried about not being believed within the community, and that's been exacerbated because of lockdown. Also, some deaf people really don't like the technology of using video calling. Some people prefer to use text message or ideally to meet face to face. And not all deaf people have access to laptops and technology at home to be able to make these calls, and that can leave them even more isolated, or they don't have access to Wi-Fi, for example. Most professionals, such as those in social services, for example, would ask deaf people to attend conferences now that can't be face-to-face, would be on Microsoft Teams or on Zoom. But it can be really difficult if a deaf person just has a phone, because there's less control over those conference services on a phone. It can be really difficult to find who's signing, who's talking. And obviously a laptop is better for that. But yeah, it can be when the deaf person's accessing these meetings on their phone, they can't find the interpreter in the meetings because they're looking at such a small screen. And obviously we need to consider that for deaf people, it's their right to have access to those meetings. Sometimes it might be there's poor Wi-Fi or poor signal, or a deaf person might just be using 4G. They could be living rurally and they don't know who to ask for help, and they could feel trapped potentially. As we know, during the crisis, a lot of courts have been closed or suspended. So courts have been saying for a lot of deaf people that they're having to attend court because they don't think it will work remotely using an interpreter. So a lot of deaf people have been forced to attend court. But as you can imagine, some interpreters are not keen to go face to face to a court in this current crisis. So there's even further barriers that deaf people are facing in terms of accessing court sessions. So I want to make sure, after talking about the barriers, talking about how you can stay safe. So if you're stuck at home and feeling isolated, make sure that you inform family or friends or neighbours, for example, somebody you could trust, of what is going on at home if something isn't right. Make sure that you've got a safe space that you could go to when the abuser isn't there. So, for example, maybe you could go to the toilet and text that family member or friend, or maybe you could go to a private room and send a quick message if you need to. If you're wondering, how you'll be able to escape, make a plan, for example. Inform a neighbour that you're going to set up a signal, for example, so they could help you on whichever day it is that you wanted to flee. So, for example, if something, happened at home that was scary and you needed support, you could, for example, knock on the wall and then your neighbour would know to listen out for that. Or you could flash a light from your phone or a torch, for example, out the window, so that your neighbour could watch out and see, I know that means we need to contact somebody to get them help. Or it could be that you're agreeing to text a person, a secret code, for example. You're going to text them the word red, and that means your friend knows that you're in danger. Or yellow, for example, to say that I'm safe. So if someone says, how are you? And you could text back red, that means the family or friend member would know to contact the police.